The champagne flute slipped from Marcus Wellington's trembling fingers, crystal shattering against the marble floor of the first-class lounge as he stared through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the gleaming Boeing 787 that would carry him to Tokyo. For a man worth $300 million who had built his empire from nothing and commanded boardrooms with the confidence of a Wall Street titan, the sight of that aircraft door might as well have been the gates of hell itself. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone, with one thought consuming his mind: cancel everything. The other passengers in the exclusive American Airlines flagship lounge barely glanced up from their devices and conversations, but Marcus felt their eyes on him anyway. He was Marcus Wellington, the Marcus Wellington, whose tech company had revolutionized cloud computing, whose face graced the covers of Fortune and Forbes, whose very presence in a room could shift stock prices. Yet here he stood, paralyzed by a fear so primal and overwhelming that his carefully constructed world felt like it was crumbling around him. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths as he tried to calm himself using every technique his high-priced therapist had taught him. Count to 10, deep breathing, visualization. None of it worked. The aircraft sat on the tarmac like a massive silver predator, waiting to devour him alive. His rational mind knew it was absurd. He had flown hundreds of times before his phobia developed, but rationality had abandoned him completely, leaving only the raw, primal terror that had controlled his life for the past 5 years. "Mr. Wellington?" The gate agent's voice cut through his panic like a knife. She was young, probably fresh out of college, with perfectly applied makeup and a smile that belonged on a recruitment poster. "We're ready to begin boarding for Flight 175 to Tokyo. As our flagship first passenger, you're welcome to board at any time." Marcus turned, his steel-gray eyes wide with something no one had ever seen before: pure, unfiltered terror. His 6'2" frame, usually radiating authority in his custom Armani suit, seemed to shrink as he approached the gate. The young agent's smile faltered as she noticed his ashen complexion and the way his breathing had become shallow and rapid. The transformation was shocking to anyone who knew him. Just yesterday, he had dominated a hostile board meeting with the cold precision of a chess grandmaster, dismantling his opposition with surgical efficiency. Last week, he had negotiated a $100 million acquisition while barely breaking a sweat. But now, faced with the simple act of boarding an airplane, Marcus Wellington, the man who had never shown weakness, never admitted defeat, never allowed even a crack in his armor of invincibility, was falling apart. "Sir, are you feeling all right?" she asked, genuine concern replacing her professional cheerfulness. Before you continue with this incredible story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss these amazing tales of human connection and transformation. Marcus couldn't speak. His throat felt like sandpaper, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to run. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had conquered hostile takeovers, survived 3 economic recessions, built a tech empire from his garage in Palo Alto, and faced down senators in congressional hearings about privacy regulations. But this simple act of stepping onto an airplane had reduced him to a terrified child. The memories crashed over him like tsunami waves. The night 5 years ago when everything changed. He had been preparing for the biggest deal of his career, a merger with a European tech giant that would have catapulted his company into the global stratosphere. The flight to London was routine, just another business trip in a life filled with them. But then, the news reports started coming in about severe turbulence on transatlantic flights, and something deep in his brain snapped. He remembered pacing his penthouse apartment until dawn, his mind creating increasingly horrific scenarios of metal failure and screaming passengers and the infinite darkness of the Atlantic Ocean. By morning, his fear had crystallized into something unshakable. He would never set foot on an airplane again. He had driven 18 hours to catch a ship to London, arriving just in time to salvage the deal, but the damage to his psyche was permanent. The boarding area began to fill with other first-class passengers, their curious glances growing more frequent as they recognized him. Whispers started to ripple through the crowd like wildfire. "Is that Marcus Wellington, the tech billionaire? What's wrong with him? He looks like he's seen a ghost. Isn't that the guy who was on the cover of Time last month?" A middle-aged businessman in an expensive Brioni suit nudged his companion, speaking just loud enough for others to hear. "That's the guy who closed the biggest deal in Silicon Valley history last month. My broker says his stock is up 300% this year. Look at him now. He can't even get on a plane." His voice carried a mixture of fascination and schadenfreude that made Marcus's shame burn even hotter. A woman in head-to-toe Chanel lifted her phone discreetly, trying to capture the moment when the mighty Marcus Wellington showed human weakness. "My followers are going to love this," she whispered to her friend. "The man who disrupted entire industries brought to his knees by a simple airplane." Marcus heard every word, felt every stare burning into him like hot coals. His reputation, built over 15 years of ruthless business acumen and unshakable confidence, was disintegrating before his eyes. The carefully crafted image of invincibility that had intimidated competitors and inspired confidence in investors was cracking apart like ice on a frozen pond. The gate agent tried to guide him toward the jet bridge, but his feet wouldn't move. His Italian leather shoes, custom-made in Florence and worth more than most people's monthly salary, felt bolted to the carpet. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the perfectly climate-controlled terminal, and he could feel his shirt sticking to his back beneath his jacket. "Mr. Wellington, the flight is ready for departure," she said gently, her voice taking on the tone one might use with a frightened animal. "Perhaps you'd like to board now? Your seat is ready. It's our most spacious first-class suite, with a fully flat bed and every amenity you could need." He shook his head violently, backing away from the gate like it was radioactive. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he fought against the tsunami of panic threatening to drag him under. The physical symptoms were getting worse. His vision was starting to blur around the edges. His heart was hammering against his ribcage like it was trying to escape, and his skin felt simultaneously hot and cold. The crowd was growing larger now, and phones were emerging from pockets and purses with increasing frequency. In seconds, his moment of weakness would be splashed across social media, trending on Twitter, analyzed on financial news networks. "Tech mogul has meltdown at airport," the headlines would read. "Marcus Wellington grounded by fear. The man who conquered Silicon Valley can't conquer his own mind." His competitors would smell blood in the water within hours. Stock prices would fluctuate based on speculation about his mental stability. Board members would start questioning his leadership. Investors would wonder if the man they had trusted with billions of dollars was having some kind of breakdown. His empire could crumble because he couldn't take a simple flight to Tokyo. "I can't," he whispered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "I can't do it. I won't do it." The gate agent's eyes widened in disbelief. She had been working for American Airlines for 3 years, and she had never encountered anything like this. Passengers got nervous about flying all the time, sure, but this was different. This was a complete psychological breakdown happening in real time, in full view of hundreds of witnesses, involving one of the most powerful men in America. Behind her, the flight crew was watching with growing concern and confusion. The captain, a distinguished man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and 30 years of experience, stepped forward with the authority of someone who had faced every conceivable flight situation. "Mr. Wellington, I'm Captain Rodriguez. I've been flying for 3 decades, logged over 20,000 hours in the air, and I want you to know that this aircraft represents the pinnacle of aviation safety. The Boeing 787 has one of the best safety records in commercial aviation. The weather is absolutely perfect today, clear skies from here to Tokyo. We have an excellent crew, state-of-the-art equipment, and I personally inspected this aircraft this morning." Marcus's laugh came out as more of a sob, hollow and bitter. "I know the statistics, Captain. I know flying is safer than driving on the freeway. I know that I'm more likely to be struck by lightning than die in a plane crash. I know that commercial aviation is the safest form of transportation ever inventing. But none of that matters when your brain is convinced that stepping onto that plane is signing your own death warrant." He ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, destroying hours of grooming in seconds. "Do you think I want to be afraid of this? Do you think I enjoy having my life controlled by something so irrational? I built a $300 million company by taking calculated risks, by making logical decisions based on data and analysis. But when it comes to flying, logic doesn't exist. There's just this voice in my head screaming that I'm going to die if I get on that plane." The crowd pressed closer, smartphones recording every moment of his breakdown. A woman in designer clothes whispered loudly to her husband, "Can you believe this? The man who revolutionized cloud computing can't handle getting on a plane? I heard he flew everywhere just a few years ago. What happened to him?" A teenage girl, probably no more than 16, and clearly from a wealthy family based on her designer clothes and expensive luggage, held up her phone and giggled to her friend. "This is definitely going viral. Hashtag Marcus Wellington Meltdown. The mighty tech mogul afraid of flying like a little kid. My dad's going to flip when he sees this. He's always talking about how Wellington is some kind of business genius." The shame burned through him like acid, more corrosive than any business failure or public criticism he had ever endured. He had testified before Congress without breaking a sweat, faced down hostile journalists who tried to destroy his reputation, and stared down boardroom coups with ice-cold composure. But this wasn't business. This was something that reached into the most primitive part of his brain and activated every survival instinct he possessed. More passengers were gathering now, and he could see the mixture of emotions on their faces. Some showed genuine concern. Others barely concealed excitement at witnessing the downfall of someone so powerful. And still others displayed the kind of morbid fascination people have for car accidents. A few business travelers who clearly recognized him were texting furiously, probably alerting their own companies to the spectacle unfolding at Gate 47. "Sir, we really need to board," Captain Rodriguez said, his patience beginning to wear thin despite his professional demeanor. "We have a schedule to maintain, and delaying the flight affects hundreds of other passengers. I understand you're experiencing some anxiety, but perhaps you could work through it during the flight? Our cabin crew is trained to help passengers who feel nervous about flying." Marcus stumbled backward another step, his chest heaving as if he'd run a marathon. The captain's words echoed in his head, "Work through it during the flight." The man had no idea what he was asking. Working through it would mean being trapped in a metal tube at 37,000 feet with nowhere to run, nothing to do but sit with his terror for 14 hours while crossing the Pacific Ocean. "Cancel it," he said, his voice growing louder and more desperate. "Cancel the whole trip. I'll find another way to get to Tokyo. Maybe a ship. Do people still travel by ship? How long would it take to drive to the nearest port? There has to be a cargo ship or something." The absurdity of his words wasn't lost on him even as he spoke them. A cross-Pacific voyage would take weeks, and the deal he was flying to secure had a deadline that couldn't be moved. But rational thought was a luxury he couldn't afford when every cell in his body was screaming at him to flee. The gate agent exchanged worried glances with the captain. This was unprecedented territory for both of them. They had procedures for handling drunk passengers, medical emergencies, and unruly travelers, but nothing in their training had prepared them for a complete psychological collapse by one of the most famous business leaders in America. "Mr. Wellington," the captain tried again, his tone softer now. "I have a daughter about your age, and she used to be terrified of flying. What helped her was understanding that fear is just our brain's way of trying to protect us, but sometimes it gets the signals wrong. Flying isn't dangerous. Your brain just thinks it is because it seems unnatural to be so high off the ground. Your daughter isn't responsible for a company with 12,000 employees and their families depending on her decisions," Marcus shot back, immediately regretting his harsh tone. The captain was trying to help, and his fear was making him lash out at people who didn't deserve it. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to snap at you. It's just, this isn't just about me. If I have a panic attack on this flight, if something happens to me, it affects thousands of people. Stock prices, employee jobs, investor confidence. The weight of all that makes the fear so much worse." Behind the growing crowd of onlookers, a flight attendant named Sarah Chen was watching the scene unfold with growing concern and recognition. She had worked for American Airlines for 8 years, and in that time she had helped countless passengers overcome their fear of flying. But she had never seen terror quite like this, so raw, so consuming, so utterly overwhelming that it had completely shut down a man who was famous for his composure under pressure. Sarah was 28 years old, with kind brown eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense to the person underneath, and a gentle demeanor that made passengers feel instantly at ease. She had grown up in a modest home in Sacramento, the daughter of immigrant parents who had worked multiple jobs to give her and her younger brother opportunities they never had. Her father had been a janitor at 3 different office buildings, working 16-hour days to pay for her education. Her mother had cleaned houses for wealthy families while taking night classes to learn English. Every day, Sarah saw passengers from all walks of life. Tech executives who treated her like she was invisible, celebrities who demanded special treatment, politicians who expected her to recognize their importance, and ordinary people who genuinely appreciated her service. She had learned to read people quickly, to see past their external presentations, to understand what they really needed. But she had never encountered someone so powerful, brought so low by something so seemingly simple. What struck her most about Marcus Wellington wasn't his obvious wealth or his famous face. It was the way his fear had stripped away every layer of pretense and protection, leaving him completely vulnerable in a way that most powerful people never allowed themselves to be. There was something almost beautiful about it, the way terror had made him utterly human in front of hundreds of strangers. What would you do in this situation? Would you try to help someone who seemed beyond helping, or would you simply watch like everyone else? Let us know in the comments below and share your own experiences with overcoming fear. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. While the captain and gate agent continued their futile attempts to convince Marcus to board, while the crowd grew larger and more intrusive, while phones captured every moment of his breakdown for posterity, she quietly slipped through the crowd with the practiced efficiency of someone who had navigated airplane aisles for nearly a decade. Her heart was pounding, not from fear, but from determination mixed with something else. A recognition that transcended the obvious differences in their social status and wealth. She had seen something in his eyes that others had missed, something that reminded her of her own father on the day he had been forced to fly across the country for his mother's funeral. She approached slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. Up close, she could see the fine details of his distress, the way his expensive shirt was damp with sweat, the tremor in his hands that he couldn't quite control, the rapid pulse visible in his neck, the way his pupils were dilated with pure adrenaline. "Mr. Wellington," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper so that only he could hear. He turned toward her, his eyes wild and unfocused, like a cornered animal looking for an escape route. This wasn't just fear of flying, this was a full-blown panic attack that was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. She had seen it before in passengers, but never to this extreme degree. "I know you don't know me," she said, stepping just close enough that her words wouldn't carry to the eager crowd, but maintaining enough distance to avoid making him feel trapped. "But I need you to listen to me for just one moment. Can you do that?" Something in her tone, calm, non-judgmental, genuinely caring without a trace of pity or condescension, cut through the chaos in his mind like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. For the first time since arriving at the gate, Marcus focused on a single face in the crowd. Hers was different from the others. Where they showed curiosity, judgment, excitement at witnessing his downfall, or the kind of voyeuristic fascination people have for celebrity meltdowns, her eyes held only compassion. There was an intelligence in her gaze that he recognized immediately, not the calculating intelligence of business rivals or the predatory intelligence of those who sought to exploit weakness, but the emotional intelligence of someone who truly understood human suffering. It was the same look he had seen in his mother's eyes during his father's final illness, the look of someone who could witness pain without being overwhelmed by it. "What's your name?" he managed to ask, his voice hoarse from trying to control his breathing. Sarah Chen. I'm one of the flight attendants who'll be taking care of you today, if you decide to join us." She paused, studying his face with the same intensity he might use to analyze a complex business proposal. There was no rush in her manner, no pressure, just patient attention. "Can I tell you something that might sound a little crazy?" He nodded, desperate for anything that might provide relief from the hurricane of panic consuming him. At this point, he was willing to listen to anyone who might offer a different perspective, a new way of thinking about the terror that had hijacked his rational mind. Sarah leaned closer, close enough that her voice was nothing more than a whisper meant only for him. The crowd strained to hear, pressing forward with the hungry curiosity of people witnessing something unprecedented, but her words were carefully modulated to be lost in the ambient noise of the busy terminal. "I see a man who has spent his entire life taking care of everyone else, employees, investors, shareholders, customers. You've built something extraordinary that provides jobs for thousands of people and technology that makes millions of lives better. But right now, you're not Marcus Wellington, the CEO. You're just a scared human being who needs someone to take care of him for once. And that's not weakness, that's just being human." She paused, her eyes never leaving his face, watching for his reaction. "You don't have to be strong right now. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to protect your image or maintain your reputation. For the next few hours, all you have to do is trust me and my crew to take care of you while you take care of the most important business deal of your career. Can you do that? Can you let someone else be strong for you, just this once?" Whatever else she whispered took less than 10 seconds more, but the effect was nothing short of miraculous. Marcus's eyes widened, not with fear this time, but with something approaching wonder. His breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to slow and deepen. The trembling in his hands gradually subsided, and for the first time in 30 minutes, his shoulders relaxed. The crowd was murmuring now, confused and frustrated by the sudden change in his demeanor. What could she possibly have said to transform him so completely? The gate agent and captain watched in amazement as Marcus straightened his tie with steady hands, smoothed down his suit jacket, and took a deep, steadying breath. "How did you?" he started to ask, but she held up a gentle hand. "Some things don't need explanations," she said with a small smile that seemed to light up her entire face. "Are you ready to trust me now?" For a moment, Marcus just stared at her, trying to process what had just happened. The fear was still there. He could feel it lurking in the background like a wild animal that had been temporarily calmed, but not completely tamed. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in 5 years, the terror didn't own him completely. "Are you ready now, sir?" Captain Rodriguez asked, hardly daring to believe what he was witnessing. Marcus looked at Sarah one more time, his expression now filled with something that hadn't been there before. Not just gratitude, but a spark of curiosity and admiration that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the remarkable woman who had somehow reached through his panic and pulled him back from the edge of complete breakdown. "Yes," he said, his voice stronger now, though still carrying traces of vulnerability that made him seem more human than he had appeared in any business magazine profile. "I think I am." As they walked toward the aircraft door, Marcus fell into step beside Sarah. The crowd parted before them like the Red Sea, their whispers now tinged with confusion and disappointment rather than mockery. They had come to witness the downfall of a powerful man, but instead they were seeing something far more complex, a moment of human connection that had transformed terror into courage. "I've never seen anything like that in 20 years of working in this terminal," the gate agent whispered to a colleague. "One moment he was ready to bolt for the exit, hyperventilating and sweating through that expensive suit, and the next, he was walking onto the plane like nothing had happened. What could she possibly have said to him?" The colleague shrugged, equally mystified. "Whatever it was, she should teach a master class. I've seen grown men cry at the thought of flying, but I've never seen anyone that far gone be talked down so quickly." But something had happened. Something that transcended the simple mechanics of overcoming a phobia. As Marcus stepped across the threshold of the aircraft, he felt as if he was crossing more than just the gap between jet bridge and airplane. He was crossing from one version of himself to another, from the man who had let fear control him to someone who was beginning to understand that strength sometimes came from the most unexpected places. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 787 was a masterpiece of luxury engineering. Each suite was essentially a private room with a door that closed completely, offering privacy that rivaled the finest hotels. The seats converted to fully flat beds, each equipped with its own entertainment system, power outlets, and storage compartments. Under normal circumstances, Marcus would have appreciated the attention to detail and the way the design maximized both comfort and privacy. But today, he barely noticed the leather and wood appointments, the crisp linens, or the champagne waiting in crystal flutes. His entire focus was on Sarah as she guided him to his seat with movements that were professional but somehow personal at the same time. The other passengers were settling in, their conversations still buzzing with speculation about what they had witnessed. A tech journalist who recognized Marcus from various industry events was already typing furiously on his laptop, probably crafting a story about the incident for his blog. A venture capitalist who had competed with Marcus for deals was speaking quietly into his phone, likely reporting the scene to his partners. But Marcus barely heard them. His attention was focused entirely on the woman who had somehow reached into the depths of his terror and found a way to pull him through to the other side. "Can I get you anything to help you settle in?" Sarah asked, her voice back to its professional tone now that they were no longer alone, but her eyes still held the warmth and understanding she had shown him at the gate. "Actually," Marcus said, surprising himself with his boldness, "could you tell me what you said back there? Those words, they changed everything. I've been to therapists, tried medication, read every book on anxiety and phobias. Nothing worked. But whatever you said in those few seconds accomplished what years of professional help couldn't." Sarah's smile was mysterious, almost playful, but also tinged with something deeper. Some magic works better when it stays mysterious, don't you think? Besides, the words weren't really magic. You were ready to hear them. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us of what we already know deep down. As the other passengers boarded and the aircraft prepared for departure, Marcus found himself stealing glances at Sarah as she moved through the cabin, helping passengers stow their luggage and ensuring everyone was comfortable. There was something about the way she carried herself that fascinated him. Confident but not arrogant, kind but not weak, professional but still authentically human. She treated every passenger with the same genuine care she had shown him, whether they were flying first class or had been upgraded from economy. He watched her help an elderly gentleman with his seatbelt, her patience evident as she explained the safety features for what was clearly his first time flying internationally. She shared a quiet laugh with a young couple on their honeymoon, celebrating their excitement while ensuring they understood the meal service options. She calmed a nervous mother traveling alone with two small children, offering practical advice about keeping kids entertained during the long flight. Marcus had met countless people in his business career: CEOs, politicians, celebrities, royalty, Nobel Prize winners. He had dined with heads of state and negotiated with some of the most powerful people in the world, but none of them had possessed whatever quality Sarah had shown him at the gate. She had seen him at his most vulnerable, his most broken, and instead of taking advantage of that weakness or turning away in disgust, she had offered him exactly what he needed without asking for anything in return. The plane began to taxi toward the runway, and Marcus felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in his chest. His hands gripped the leather armrests of his seat as the aircraft moved away from the gate, and he could feel his breathing starting to quicken again. But this time, instead of building into full-blown panic, the fear remained manageable. Every time the terror threatened to overwhelm him, he found himself thinking about Sarah's whispered words, and somehow that was enough to keep him grounded. He pulled out his phone and tried to distract himself with emails, but his mind kept wandering back to the remarkable woman who had changed everything in the span of a few whispered sentences. What was it about her that had gotten through to him when nothing else could? Was it her tone, her words, something in her eyes that conveyed understanding without judgment. During the flight, he continued to watch her work with growing fascination and admiration. She had a gift for reading people, for understanding what they needed even before they asked. When a businessman in seat 3A became agitated because his laptop wasn't connecting to the Wi-Fi, she didn't just troubleshoot the technical problem, she engaged him in conversation about his work, helping him relax while she resolved the issue. When an older woman in seat 5C mentioned that she was flying to Tokyo to visit her son who was stationed there with the military, Sarah spent extra time with her, sharing stories about the city and recommending places to visit. She had clearly been to Tokyo many times, and her descriptions were vivid and personal, not the generic recommendations of a guidebook. Marcus found himself wondering about her life outside of work. Did she travel for pleasure as well as professionally? What did she do on her days off? Did she have family, friends, a boyfriend? The questions surprised him. He rarely found himself curious about people's personal lives unless it related to business. But something about Sarah made him want to know everything about her. When she brought him his lunch, a perfectly prepared filet mignon that he barely tasted because he was too focused on the brief interactions they had whenever she checked on him, he decided to take another risk. "Sarah," he said quietly, mindful of the other passengers nearby, "would you mind if I ask you something personal?" She paused in her service, giving him her full attention in a way that made him feel like he was the only passenger on the plane. "Of course, Mr. Wellington. What would you like to know?" How did you know? How did you know exactly what to say when everyone else failed? I've worked with some of the best minds in business, psychology, even had a few Nobel laureates as advisors, but none of them understood what you grasped in a matter of minutes. Her expression grew thoughtful, and for a moment he saw past her professional demeanor to the intelligent, compassionate woman underneath. "I grew up with a father who was afraid of many things," she said softly, her voice taking on the intimacy of shared confidence. "He was brave in every way that mattered. He worked 3 jobs to support our family, never complained about the sacrifices he made for us, faced every hardship with dignity. But he was terrified of heights, of flying, of anything that took him too far from solid ground." Marcus leaned closer, drawn in by the intimacy of her confession and the way her eyes grew distant with memory. "When I was 16, she continued, "my grandmother in China became very ill, and my father had to fly there to see her one last time. It was the only way to get there quickly enough. I watched him at San Francisco International Airport, and he looked exactly like you did today. Terrified, but determined not to let his fear win, because the stakes were too high." She paused, collecting her thoughts before continuing. "My mother tried to talk him through it with logic and statistics, exactly what Captain Rodriguez tried with you. The airport staff tried to rush him along, telling him that delays affected other passengers. My younger brother, who was only 12 at the time, got frustrated and told him to just be brave, as if courage was something you could just decide to have. But nothing worked until I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. What did you do? I reminded him of who he was beneath the fear. I helped him remember that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's moving forward despite being afraid. And I told him that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is trust someone else to help carry you through the difficult moments." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the airplane's climate control, and everything to do with the realization that he was in the presence of someone truly extraordinary. Sarah Chen wasn't just a flight attendant who had helped him overcome his fear of flying. She was a woman who understood that true strength came not from never falling down, but from being willing to accept help when you did. "Did it work with your father?" Sarah's smile was soft and tinged with sadness. "It did. He made that flight, and he was able to say goodbye to my grandmother before she passed. But more importantly, he learned something about himself that day. That being vulnerable doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. It was a lesson that changed how he approached a lot of things in his life. And what about you? Did you learn something too? I learned that sometimes the people who seem the strongest are the ones who need the most help, and that helping someone through their worst moment can be one of the most meaningful things you'll ever do. She paused, studying his face with that same perceptive gaze that had seen through his panic at the gate. I also learned that fear doesn't discriminate. It can affect anyone, regardless of their success or status or wealth. In that moment of terror, we're all just human beings who need compassion. Like this video if you believe in the power of human kindness to transform even the most impossible situations, and if you've ever had someone help you through your darkest moment. As the flight continued across the Pacific, Marcus found himself thinking less about the business deal that awaited him in Tokyo and more about the woman who had made this journey possible. He had built his fortune by recognizing value that others overlooked, by seeing potential where others saw only problems. And sitting here at 37,000 feet, he was beginning to realize that he had stumbled upon the most valuable discovery of his life. But it wasn't just gratitude he was feeling. As he watched Sarah interact with other passengers throughout the long flight, calming a nervous child with infinite patience, helping an elderly man understand his entertainment system, sharing a moment of genuine laughter with a young couple celebrating their anniversary, he found himself genuinely impressed by her skill, her grace, and her authentic care for others. She wasn't just doing a job, she was making a difference in people's lives, one small act of kindness at a time. There was an artistry to the way she moved through the cabin, anticipating needs before they were expressed, diffusing potential conflicts with diplomatic skill, creating an atmosphere of comfort and safety that had nothing to do with the aircraft's engineering and everything to do with her presence. Marcus realized that in all his years of building his company, managing thousands of employees, and interacting with world leaders, he had rarely encountered someone who combined such emotional intelligence with such natural grace. Sarah possessed qualities that couldn't be taught in business school or acquired through experience. She had an innate understanding of human nature that allowed her to connect with people across all boundaries of class, culture, and circumstance. When the cabin lights dimmed and most passengers settled in to sleep, Marcus remained awake, his mind racing with thoughts and emotions he hadn't expected. He was a man who prided himself on being rational, logical, focused on measurable outcomes and quantifiable results. But what he was feeling now defied all of those familiar frameworks. The fear of flying was still there, lurking in the background of his consciousness like a sleeping dragon that might wake at any moment. But it no longer controlled him. More than that, he was beginning to understand that the fear itself wasn't the real problem. The real problem had been his isolation, his belief that he had to face everything alone, his conviction that showing vulnerability was tantamount to showing weakness. Sarah appeared beside his seat, her voice barely above a whisper in the darkened cabin. "Having trouble sleeping?" "Something like that," he admitted, turning to face her more fully. In the dim lighting, she looked different, younger, more relaxed, with her hair slightly mussed from the long hours of service, and her professional composure softened by fatigue. "I keep thinking about what happened back at the gate. I've never experienced anything like that before." "The panic attack?" "No," he said, choosing his words carefully. The feeling that someone actually saw me. Not Marcus Wellington, the CEO, not the guy on magazine covers, not the business success story that people either want to emulate or tear down. Just me, the man who was terrified and trying desperately not to show it. Sarah's expression softened, and for a moment the professional distance between them seemed to disappear entirely. "That must be lonely," she said, simply. The words hit him with unexpected force, cutting through his defenses with surgical precision. Lonely. Yes, that was exactly what it was, though he had never allowed himself to acknowledge it so directly. He had surrounded himself with employees, advisors, colleagues, and business associates. He had attended countless galas, conferences, and networking events. He had been profiled in magazines, interviewed on television, and invited to speak at prestigious universities. But through all of it, he had been playing a role, maintaining an image, never allowing anyone to see the uncertainty and fear that lived beneath the surface. The higher he climbed in business, the more isolated he became, until success itself became a kind of prison that separated him from authentic human connection. "It is," he admitted, surprised by his own honesty, "more lonely than I realized until today. When you're Marcus Wellington, people don't see you as someone who might need help or comfort or just basic human understanding. They see you as a resource to be utilized, a contact to be cultivated, or a competitor to be defeated. But they don't see you as a person who might be struggling with something as simple and human as fear." Sarah settled into the empty seat beside him, her movement so natural and unassuming that it didn't occur to him to question whether flight attendants were supposed to sit with passengers during service hours. All he knew was that her presence made the vast aircraft feel less isolating, less frightening, more like a space where genuine connection was possible. "Can I ask you something now?" she said, her voice soft in the dimly lit cabin. He nodded, grateful for her interest and curious about what she wanted to know. "What made you so afraid of flying? Was it always like this, or did something specific happen?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering whether to share something he had never told anyone. Not his business partners, not his therapist, not even his own family. The story was too raw, too revealing of the psychological wounds that success and wealth couldn't heal. But something about the darkness of the cabin, the hum of the engines, and Sarah's genuine interest made him want to be completely honest. 5 years ago, he began slowly, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the aircraft. "I was supposed to fly to London for the most important acquisition in my company's history. The deal would have tripled our valuation overnight and established us as a true global player. I had been working toward this moment for years. It was going to be the culmination of everything I had built." He paused, remembering that night in his penthouse apartment, pacing the marble floors until dawn, while his mind created increasingly horrific scenarios. "The night before the flight, I got word that there had been some severe turbulence on the transatlantic route. Nothing dangerous, according to the reports, just enough to delay a few flights and make passengers uncomfortable. But suddenly, I couldn't stop thinking about everything that could go wrong. Not just turbulence, but mechanical failures, pilot error, terrorist attacks, freak weather events. My rational mind knew the odds were infinitesimal, but my imagination was creating disaster scenarios faster than my logic could debunk them." Sarah listened without interruption, her attention focused entirely on his words, her expression showing understanding rather than judgment. "I spent the entire night researching plane crashes, reading accident reports, watching news footage of aviation disasters. By morning, I was convinced that getting on that plane would be signing my own death warrant. The fear had become so overwhelming that I couldn't even think about the business implications. All I could think about was dying in a fiery crash over the Atlantic Ocean. But you made it to London somehow? I ended up driving to New York and catching the first available ship, a cargo vessel that took passengers. 18 hours of driving, then 6 days at sea. I arrived in London just hours before the deadline, exhausted and barely coherent, but I closed the deal. He laughed bitterly. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had risked everything I'd worked for because I was afraid of the safest form of transportation ever invented. And the fear just stayed with you after that? Marcus nodded, his hands unconsciously gripping the armrest as he remembered the panic that had controlled his life for so long. It got worse, actually. Every time I even thought about flying, I was right back in that place of pure terror. I started structuring my entire business around ground transportation and video conferences. I turned down opportunities, missed crucial meetings, and watched competitors gain advantages because I couldn't get on an airplane. But this trip to Tokyo, you couldn't avoid it this time? It's the biggest deal of my career, maybe the biggest deal in tech history. A consortium of Japanese investors wants to partner with us on developing next-generation quantum computing infrastructure. The contract is worth potentially $50 billion over the next decade, and it would position us as the dominant player in the quantum revolution. His voice grew more intense as he explained the stakes. But these investors are old-school traditionalists. They insisted on meeting in person in Tokyo, and they gave us a very narrow window that couldn't be changed. No video conferences, no alternative locations, no delays. It was either get on that plane or watch 5 years of preparation and negotiation evaporate. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing the magnitude of what he had shared. So you were facing a choice between your greatest fear and your greatest opportunity. Exactly. And until today, I was convinced that my fear was going to win. I had my assistant researching every possible alternative: cargo ships, trains, even chartering a yacht. Nothing would get me there in time. He turned to look at her directly. That's what made what you did so remarkable. You didn't just help me get on a plane. You helped me choose my future over my fear. The conversation was interrupted by a call button from another passenger, and Sarah excused herself to attend to their needs. But the brief interruption gave Marcus time to reflect on what he had just shared. He had never spoken so openly about his phobia, never admitted to anyone the full extent to which fear had controlled his decisions. Yet, with Sarah, the words had come easily, without shame or embarrassment. When she returned a few minutes later, she brought with her 2 cups of tea and a plate of fresh fruit. "I thought you might be getting dehydrated," she said. "Long flights can be rough on your system, especially when you're dealing with stress." The gesture was simple but thoughtful, and Marcus realized that no one had taken care of him in such a basic, human way in longer than he could remember. His life was managed by assistants and housekeepers and personal trainers and private chefs, but none of them provided the kind of genuine care that Sarah was showing him. "Thank you," he said, accepting the tea gratefully. "Can I ask you something now? Something personal?" "Of course. How did you end up as a flight attendant? I mean, it's clear you have incredible emotional intelligence and people skills. You could probably succeed at anything you wanted to do." Sarah smiled, but there was a complexity to her expression that suggested the question touched on something deeper. "That's a story that might surprise you," she said. "I actually have a master's degree in psychology from UC Berkeley. I was planning to become a therapist, maybe eventually open my own practice." Marcus's eyebrows rose in surprise. "What happened?" "My father got sick during my final year of grad school, cancer. The treatments were expensive, and insurance only covered so much. I needed a job that paid well and had good benefits, something that would let me help support my family while I was finishing my degree. Her voice grew softer as she continued. I applied to be a flight attendant, thinking it would be temporary, just until Dad got better and I could afford to start my career in psychology. But I discovered something unexpected. I loved it. Not just the travel, though that was amazing, but the opportunity to help people during some of their most vulnerable moments. How so? Flying brings out people's true selves, she explained. Strip away the familiar surroundings, put someone in a metal tube 30,000 feet in the air, and suddenly their defenses come down. I get to see executives who are terrified of turbulence, tough guys who cry during romantic movies, celebrities who are grateful for basic kindness, and sometimes I get the chance to help someone through a panic attack or a difficult moment, like I did with you today. Marcus found himself hanging on every word, fascinated by her perspective and the way she had found meaning in what others might consider routine work. My father recovered, thank God, and I could have left to pursue psychology, but I realized I was already practicing psychology, just in a different setting. Every day, I get to use my training to help people, to read their emotional needs, to provide comfort and support when they need it most. How many therapists get to impact hundreds of lives every week? That's an incredible way to look at it, Marcus said, genuinely impressed. But doesn't it get exhausting, dealing with difficult passengers, long hours, irregular schedules? Sometimes, she admitted. But then I have a day like today where I get to help someone overcome their greatest fear and maybe change their life in the process. That makes all the difficult parts worthwhile. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, sipping their tea and watching the stars through the aircraft windows. The plane was remarkably steady, flying through clear skies with barely any turbulence, and Marcus realized that his fear had receded to a manageable background hum. He was actually enjoying the flight, something he had thought impossible just hours earlier. "Sarah," he said eventually, "I know this might sound strange, but I feel like I owe you more than just gratitude. You didn't just help me get on this plane, you helped me remember something about myself that I had forgotten."
What's that?
That it's okay to need help sometimes. That vulnerability isn't weakness, it's humanity. That the people who can see past your public persona to who you really are underneath, those people are rare and precious. Sarah's smile was warm and genuine. "You don't owe me anything, Marcus, but if you really want to thank me, promise me something. Anything. Promise me you won't go back to facing everything alone. You have people who care about you, who would be honored to help you through difficult moments. Let them." As the flight continued toward Tokyo, their conversation ranged across dozens of topics: her travels around the world, his early days building his company, her family's immigration story, his thoughts on the future of technology, her observations about human nature, his regrets about the relationships he had sacrificed for business success. Marcus found himself sharing stories he had never told anyone, revealing doubts and fears and hopes that he had kept locked away for years. And Sarah listened with the kind of attention that made him feel truly heard, offering insights that came from her unique combination of formal psychological training and years of observing people in their most unguarded moments. What struck him most was how easy it was to talk to her. Despite their different backgrounds and social circumstances, they connected on a level that transcended those superficial differences. She didn't treat him like a celebrity or a business mogul or someone whose favor she needed to curry. She simply treated him like a human being, worthy of respect and understanding. As dawn began to break outside the aircraft windows, painting the clouds in shades of gold and pink, Marcus realized that something profound had happened during the night. He had started the flight as a man controlled by fear, isolated by success, and terrified of showing weakness. But somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, in conversation with a remarkable woman who had seen past all his defenses, he had rediscovered parts of himself that he had thought were lost forever. The plane began its descent into Tokyo, and Marcus felt the familiar flutter of anxiety return. But this time, instead of escalating into panic, the fear remained manageable. He had Sarah's words to anchor him, the memory of her confidence in his strength, and most importantly, the knowledge that he wasn't facing this alone. "Nervous about the landing?" Sarah asked, noticing his increased attention to the aircraft's movements. "A little," he admitted, "but nothing like before. It's manageable now." That's progress, real, lasting progress. As they descended through the clouds and the lights of Tokyo came into view, Marcus felt a mixture of emotions: relief that the flight was almost over, excitement about the business opportunity awaiting him, but also a strange sadness that his time with Sarah was coming to an end. The landing was smooth and uneventful, and as the passengers began to disembark, Marcus found himself reluctant to leave his seat. Leaving the aircraft meant returning to his normal life, to business meetings and conference calls, and the careful maintenance of his public image. But more than that, it meant saying goodbye to Sarah, and he wasn't ready for that conversation yet. When the cabin had mostly emptied, he finally stood and gathered his belongings. Sarah was there to see him off, as she was with all the passengers, but he could see something different in her expression, a warmth that went beyond professional courtesy. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried far more weight than they normally would. "Not just for the service during the flight, but for what you did back in Los Angeles. You saved more than just my business trip. You saved me from my own limitations." "You saved yourself," she corrected gently. "I just reminded you that you could." As they walked through the aircraft door together, Marcus felt a moment of panic, not about flying this time, but about the possibility that he might never see Sarah again. The thought of returning to his life of isolation and careful emotional control suddenly seemed unbearable. They reached the jet bridge, where other crew members were preparing for the return flight. Marcus knew he should head to customs and immigration, collect his luggage, and make his way to the hotel where his business team was waiting. But instead, he found himself turning to Sarah with a question that surprised him with its importance. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a vulnerability that would have been unthinkable 24 hours earlier, "I know this might be presumptuous, and I know you probably have policies about passengers, but would you consider having dinner with me while you're in Tokyo? I realize you must be tired after the flight, and you probably have plans with your crew, but—" She held up a gentle hand, stopping his nervous rambling with a smile. "Are you asking because you're grateful, or because you're genuinely interested in getting to know me better?" The question caught him off guard with its directness, but he realized he appreciated her honesty. It was so different from the careful, strategic conversations that made up most of his social interactions, where every word was calculated for maximum advantage. "Both," he admitted. "The gratitude is definitely part of it. You changed my life today in ways I'm still trying to understand. But it's more than that. You're remarkable, Sarah, not just because of what you did for me, but because of who you are. The way you treated every passenger with the same kindness, the way you see people for who they really are rather than what they represent, the way you're not intimidated by wealth or status, but still manage to be respectful and professional. He paused, searching for the right words to express what he was feeling. "I'd like to get to know the person behind the uniform, if you're willing to let me. And I promise this has nothing to do with any kind of power dynamic or expectation. I'm just asking one human being to share a meal with another human being who finds her fascinating." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus held his breath, suddenly realizing that her answer mattered more to him than any business deal he had ever negotiated. There was something about the possibility of spending more time with her, of continuing the conversation they had started over the Pacific, that felt more important than anything else in his carefully ordered life. "I have a layover until tomorrow afternoon," she said finally. "There's a small restaurant in Shibuya that serves the best ramen in Tokyo. Nothing fancy, no private dining rooms or celebrity treatment, just good food and honest conversation in a place where nobody will recognize you or care about your net worth. Are you interested in that kind of dinner?" Marcus smiled, genuinely smiled, for the first time in longer than he could remember. "I can't think of anything I'd like more." They exchanged contact information, agreeing to meet at 7 o'clock that evening. As they parted ways in the terminal, him to collect his luggage and catch a taxi to his hotel, her to complete her post-flight duties with the crew, Marcus felt lighter than he had in years. The fear that had controlled his life for so long was still there, but it no longer defined him. More importantly, for the first time since building his empire, he was excited about something that had nothing to do with business, nothing to do with money, and everything to do with the extraordinary woman who had whispered courage into his ear when he needed it most. His business team was waiting at the hotel with briefings and presentations for the next day's crucial meetings. The quantum computing deal that had forced him onto the airplane was still the biggest opportunity of his career, worth potentially billions of dollars and the future of his company. But as Marcus reviewed the contracts and technical specifications, his mind kept wandering to the evening ahead and the chance to continue getting to know Sarah Chen. The next day's meetings went better than he could have hoped. The Japanese investors were impressed with his proposal, excited about the potential for partnership, and ready to move forward with preliminary agreements. By 5 o'clock, Marcus had secured commitments that would transform his company and establish it as a leader in quantum computing technology. But instead of the euphoria he had expected from closing such a momentous deal, Marcus found himself thinking about how none of it would have been possible without Sarah's intervention at the airport. She had quite literally made his greatest business success achievable by helping him overcome his greatest personal failure. That evening, sitting across from Sarah in the tiny ramen shop in Shibuya, Marcus realized that the most valuable thing he had gained from his flight to Tokyo wasn't the business deal he had flown there to secure. It was the discovery that connection, real, honest, vulnerable connection, was worth more than all the money in the world. The restaurant was everything Sarah had promised, authentic, unpretentious, filled with the kind of genuine atmosphere that no amount of wealth could buy. The owner, an elderly Japanese man who spoke limited English, treated them with the same warm hospitality he showed every customer, completely unaware that one of his diners was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "This is perfect," Marcus said, savoring not just the incredibly flavorful ramen, but the anonymity and simplicity of the setting. "When was the last time you were somewhere that nobody recognized you or wanted anything from you?" Sarah laughed, her eyes lighting up with genuine joy. "I was going to ask you the same thing. You look more relaxed than I've ever seen you, and I've only known you for 24 hours. "I feel more relaxed than I have in years," he admitted. "It's amazing how freeing it is to just be Marcus instead of Marcus Wellington, tech mogul and business leader, thank you for choosing a place like this." As they talked over dinner, Marcus learned more about Sarah's life and background. She had grown up in a modest home in Sacramento, where her parents had worked multiple jobs to provide opportunities for their children that they had never had themselves. Her father had eventually started his own small construction business, and her mother had become a nurse after completing her education in evening classes. "They sacrificed everything for me and my brother," Sarah said, her voice filled with affection and respect. "They never made us feel guilty about the struggles they endured, but they made sure we understood the value of hard work and the importance of helping others who were facing difficulties." Marcus found himself envious of the close family relationships Sarah described. His own path to success had been much more solitary, driven by ambition and talent, but lacking the kind of supportive foundation that had shaped Sarah's character. "What do they think about your career choice?" he asked. "Are they proud of what you've accomplished?" "They were confused at first," Sarah admitted with a smile. "They had invested so much in my education, and here I was choosing to serve drinks and snacks on airplanes instead of opening a psychology practice. But when I explained how I was using my training to help people in a different context, they understood. My mother says I'm practicing therapy at 30,000 feet." "She's not wrong," Marcus said. "What you did for me yesterday was more effective than months of traditional therapy." As the evening progressed, Marcus shared his own story. The early days of building his company from nothing, the sacrifices and risks that had led to his success, the isolation that had come with wealth and fame, and the fear that had nearly derailed everything he had worked for. "I built my entire identity around being invulnerable," he said. "The guy who never showed weakness, never admitted doubt, never asked for help. But that identity became a prison that separated me from everyone and everything that mattered." "And now?" Sarah asked. "Now I'm beginning to understand that vulnerability might actually be a superpower," he said. "It connects us to other people in ways that strength never can." They talked until the restaurant began to close, and then walked through the neon-lit streets of Tokyo, continuing their conversation as they explored the vibrant city. Marcus had visited Tokyo many times for business, but always in the context of luxury hotels and private meetings. Walking through the crowded streets with Sarah, he saw the city through completely different eyes. She showed him hidden temples tucked between modern skyscrapers, tiny bars that served the best sake in the city, and street food vendors who created culinary masterpieces from simple ingredients. More than that, she helped him see the humanity in every interaction, the courtesy of strangers, the beauty of small kindnesses, the way people from completely different cultures could connect through basic human decency. "You have a gift for seeing the best in people," Marcus observed, as they watched an elderly street musician play traditional Japanese songs for passing crowds. "Is that something you learned, or something you were born with?" "I think it's something I had to learn," Sarah replied thoughtfully. "Growing up with parents who faced discrimination and economic hardship, it would have been easy to become bitter or suspicious of others. But my parents taught me that most people are fundamentally good. They're just dealing with their own struggles and challenges. If you can see past their defenses to the human being underneath, you can usually find something worth connecting with." As their evening together came to an end, Marcus felt a familiar anxiety returning, not about flying this time, but about the possibility that this might be their only opportunity to spend time together. Sarah lived in Los Angeles, he was based in San Francisco, and their lives moved in completely different orbits. "Sarah," he said as they stood outside her hotel, "I know our circumstances are complicated, and I know you probably meet interesting passengers all the time, but I hope this doesn't have to be the end of our friendship." She looked at him with that same perceptive gaze that had seen through his panic at the airport. "What are you really asking, Marcus?" Her directness caught him off guard, but he was learning to appreciate her refusal to accept anything less than complete honesty. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to see me again when we're both back in California. I'm asking if you'd consider letting me take you to dinner somewhere that doesn't require flying across the Pacific. I'm asking if there's any possibility that what started as a moment of crisis could become something more meaningful." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Marcus felt his heart hammering in his chest with the same intensity he had experienced at the airport gate, but for completely different reasons. "Yes," she said simply, "I'd like that very much." 6 months later, as Marcus prepared to board another flight, this time with Sarah by his side, no longer as his flight attendant, but as the woman who had become the center of his world, he reflected on how profoundly his life had changed. The quantum computing deal had been even more successful than anticipated, establishing his company as a leader in next-generation technology and increasing his net worth by another $100 million. But those achievements felt secondary to the personal transformation that had begun with Sarah's whispered words at an airport gate. He had learned to fly without fear, not because the terror had disappeared completely, but because he now understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the willingness to move forward despite being afraid. More importantly, he had learned that he didn't have to face his fears alone. Sarah had introduced him to her family, and he had been welcomed with the same warmth and acceptance that she showed everyone. Her parents, who had started with nothing and built a comfortable middle-class life through hard work and determination, treated him not as a celebrity or business mogul, but as the man who made their daughter happy. In return, Marcus had opened his life to Sarah in ways he had never imagined possible. She had met his business partners and employees, attended company events as his guest, and helped him understand how to use his wealth and influence to make a meaningful difference in other people's lives. "Ready?" Sarah asked, echoing the question she had whispered to him in that crowded terminal so many months ago, but now with a completely different context and meaning. "With you, I'm ready for anything," he replied. And as they found their seats side by side, Marcus knew that the whisper that had changed everything had led him exactly where he was meant to be. The flight attendant who greeted them, a young man who was clearly new to the job, seemed nervous about serving such high-profile passengers, but Sarah put him at ease immediately, treating him with the same kindness and respect she showed everyone, sharing tips about managing difficult passengers and making the long flights more comfortable. As their plane lifted off from Los Angeles, bound for their honeymoon in Bali, Marcus looked out the window at the city falling away below them and marveled at how the same action that had once filled him with dread now felt like stepping into the beginning of their next adventure together. The fear was still there. It probably always would be. But it no longer controlled his decisions or limited his possibilities. And sitting beside the woman who had seen him at his most vulnerable and chosen to help rather than judge, Marcus understood that sometimes our greatest fears are actually guardians protecting our greatest treasures. The whisper that had gotten him onto that airplane had done more than help him overcome his phobia of flying. It had opened his heart to possibilities he had never imagined, to a kind of wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars or market cap, but in moments of authentic human connection that transformed everything. As Sarah squeezed his hand during takeoff, Marcus realized that the best things in life often came disguised as our worst nightmares, and that the people who could see our potential when we couldn't see it ourselves were the most precious gifts the universe could provide. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that our greatest fears often guard our greatest treasures, that vulnerability is not weakness, but the birthplace of courage, and that sometimes the most profound connections come from the most unexpected places. Like this video if you believe in second chances, in the power of human kindness to transform impossible situations, and in the magic that happens when we open our hearts to love in all its unexpected forms. Stay tuned for more incredible stories of courage, transformation, and the beautiful chaos of human connection that reminds us why every day is worth living.